A poor girl walks into a coffee shop asking for food. She sees a billionaire looking at a photo and asks, "Why do you have a picture of my mom?" He is shocked, starts to cry and says, "You are this woman's daughter." A gentle rain fell outside the small corner coffee shop as Edward Blake pushed open the fogged-up glass door. The bell above rang to announce his arrival. Though no one looked his way, he preferred it that way. At 62, Edward preferred not to draw attention. He chose his usual table, near the window. From there, he could watch the street, the hurried people with umbrellas and coats. The coffee arrived without him needing to order. Black mine, no sugar, courtesy of a waitress who already knew his habits. "Thank you, Martha," he said with a half smile. She returned the smile before stepping away. Edward waited for her to turn around before he reached into the inside pocket of his coat to take out the photograph. Its corners were bent, the color slightly faded, physical proof that this image had traveled with him for a long time. Claire was smiling in the picture, her brown hair tied in a ponytail, her eyes bright, full of dreams he hadn't known how to protect. 5 years, he murmured to himself, running his finger over his daughter's face. 5 years since the day she slammed the door. 5 years of silence that weighed more heavily than any noise. The coffee shop was busy that Sunday afternoon. Families filled tables, couples spoke in hushed tones, teenagers laughed loudly. It was a world that kept going, ignoring the emptiness Edward carried in his chest. He took a sip of coffee, tasting the bitterness on his tongue. The bell above the door chimed again, but Edward didn't look. He kept his eyes on the photo, lost in memories of a time that would never return. It was the unusual activity near the counter that finally caught his attention. Among the adults, a small child appeared, alone. Brown hair in 2 uneven braids, an oversized red coat on her slight frame, and slightly worn shoes. The girl stood on her tiptoes, stretching to reach the counter. Her stomach growled audibly, making her hug her belly for a moment. She looked hungry. "Excuse me." Her voice was clear, determined despite her shyness. "May I have a slice of that chocolate cake?" The attendant, a middle-aged man in a green apron, leaned forward to see her better. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" "She's working." The girl rocked back and forth, her eyes fixed on the display of sweets. "Can I take the cake with me? I'm really hungry." "Do you have money?" She shook her head, fidgeting with her braids. "No, but I can pay later, I promise." The man frowned and uneasy. He looked around as if searching for a responsible adult. Edward watched the scene in silence. The girl couldn't be more than 4 years old. She wore simple but clean clothes. She looked well cared for despite being alone. Something about her felt familiar, though he couldn't pinpoint what. "I'm sorry, little one," the attendant finally said. "I can't give you cake without payment." The disappointment on the child's face was clear, but she didn't cry or throw a tantrum. She just lowered her eyes, accepting the refusal with a dignity unusual for someone so young. Edward stood up and walked over to the counter. "I'll pay for her cake," he said, placing some bills on the counter. "And a glass of milk, too, please." The girl looked at him in surprise, her eyes wide and curious. "Thank you, sir," she said politely. "How about you eat at my table?" Edward offered, pointing to where he had been sitting. "It's warmer by the window." She hesitated for a moment, but the smell of the cake being plated by the attendant seemed to convince her. She nodded and followed Edward back to his table, climbing onto the chair across from him. Her short legs dangled above the floor. She was waiting eagerly for the cake when her gaze fell on the photograph Edward had left on the table. She leaned forward, her eyes growing wide with recognition. "Why do you have my mum's picture?" she suddenly asked. The question hit Edward like a punch. He looked from the photo to the child, stunned. The resemblance he hadn't noticed before was now obvious, overwhelming. The same eyes, the same face shape, the same tilt of the head when curious. What's your mother's name?" Edward asked, his voice suddenly dry. "Claire," the girl replied without hesitation. "Claire Blake." The world around him seemed to freeze. The noise of the coffee shop faded, as if someone had turned the volume down. It was just him and that child, connected by a name and a photograph. "And your name?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Grace." Grace. His granddaughter. The child Claire had been expecting when she left home 5 years ago. The child he had never met. "Hello, Grace," Edward said, trying to keep the emotion out of his voice. "My name is Edward Blake." "Hi, I knew your mom." "Are you her friend?" Grace asked, her eyes on the photograph. Edward paused to think. "We were close a long time ago." He turned to the counter and signaled to the attendant. "Please, a slice of chocolate cake for the girl and a glass of milk." Grace watched curiously as the man nodded and began to prepare the order. "Would you like to sit with me while you eat?" Edward offered, indicating the empty chair on the other side of the table. She hesitated only briefly before climbing onto the chair. Her short legs swung above the floor, the cake arrived, and her eyes lit up. "Thank you," she said politely before picking up her fork. Edward watched as she ate slowly, savoring each bite. He had so many questions he wanted to ask, so many things he needed to know, but he didn't want to scare her. "Do you live nearby, Grace?" She shrugged, her mouth full of chocolate. "Not too far. I came by myself," she added proudly. "Mom was sleeping. She works a lot and gets tired." "Where does she work?" "At a diner," Grace replied without offering details. "She serves food to people." She took another sip of milk, watching Edward with curiosity. He couldn't help but smile. "And you? What do you like to do when you're not at the coffee shop?" Grace pondered this while taking another sip of milk, leaving a white moustache above her lip. "Do you like stories?" she asked suddenly, changing topics in that unique way children do. "I like them very much," Edward answered, grateful for the chance to keep the conversation going. "What kind of stories do you like?" "Princesses," Grace said as she cut another piece of cake, "but not the silly ones who wait around for a prince to save them. I like the princesses who fight dragons." Edward smiled. "Sounds like you enjoy stories about courage." "Yes. Mum says courage isn't about not being scared. It's doing things even when you're scared." "Your mum is very wise," Edward said, impressed by the maturity coming from someone so young. "She's the bravest person in the whole world, and the prettiest too," Grace affirmed with conviction. "But she's always tired," she added, a hint of worry in her childish voice. "Sometimes she cries when she thinks I'm asleep." Edward's heart clenched. Claire, his daughter, alone and struggling, raising a child without help. He felt a wave of guilt so intense it nearly took his breath away. "What do you want to be when you grow up, Grace?" he asked, trying to steer the conversation to a lighter topic. She considered the question seriously, her forehead wrinkling in concentration. "I want to be a doctor, to take care of sick people, or an astronaut," she added after a pause, "so I can see the stars up close." "Both are wonderful professions," Edward said. "You're a very smart girl." Grace beamed with pride. Then, leaning across the table as if to share a secret, she asked, "Do you have children?" The question caught Edward off guard. He hesitated, his gaze drifting involuntarily to the pocket where he'd placed Claire's photo. "I do," he finally answered. "A daughter. Does she live with you?" "No. I haven't seen her in a long time." Grace took in this information, poking at her cake thoughtfully with her fork. "That's sad," she remarked simply, asking no further questions on the subject. Edward felt a heaviness settle in his chest. "It's complicated. Adults sometimes make mistakes. Big mistakes. Mom says that if we do something wrong, we have to say we're sorry." A sad smile appeared on Edward's face. "Your mom is right. Again. But sometimes saying sorry isn't that simple." "Why not?" "Because," Edward searched for the right words, "sometimes the mistake is so big that the person might not want to hear your apology." Grace considered this. Her fork paused in mid-air. "I think you should try anyway," she said at last, with the disarming simplicity only a child can manage. "Mom always forgives me when I say sorry, even when I break things." Edward swallowed hard, moved by the innocent wisdom of this 4-year-old. "You know what, Grace? I think you're absolutely right." She smiled, satisfied, and resumed eating her cake. Edward watched in silence, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought them together. His granddaughter. Claire's daughter, a small spark of hope after years of darkness. "It's snowing harder," he noted. "I need to go before it gets too dark." A warning bell went off inside Edward. "Let me walk you home. It's not safe for you to walk alone." Grace hopped down from the chair. "You don't have to. I know the way. Mom doesn't like me talking to strangers." She paused, reconsidering. "But you're not really a stranger because you know my mom." Before Edward could insist, she came closer and pointed to the photo in his hands. "Who's that woman in the picture?" Edward looked at Claire's picture, a lump forming in his throat. "She's someone very special to me," he answered carefully, putting the photo back into his coat pocket. "Someone I haven't seen in a long time." Grace nodded, as though she understood perfectly. "My mom has pictures of special people, too. She keeps them in a box under the bed. Thank you for the cake, sir." And with that, as suddenly as she had appeared, Grace walked out the coffee shop door, leaving only the echo of the bell and tiny footprints in the snow. Edward sat there, motionless, as the reality of what had just happened hit him fully. His granddaughter, Claire, so close all this time. He knew he couldn't let this chance slip away. Not again, not this time. The rain kept falling when Grace finally agreed to let Edward walk her, but only up to the corner. She finished the last bite of her cake, wiped her mouth with a napkin, and jumped down from the chair. "Thanks for the cake," she said, adjusting the oversized red coat. He paid the bill, grabbed his own coat, and put the photo of Claire in his pocket. Together, they walked to the door of the coffee shop. "Ready?" he asked, looking at the grey sky. Grace nodded with resolve. Edward opened his umbrella, and they stepped into the wet street. She walked at his side with quick steps, occasionally splashing in the puddles forming on the sidewalk. The rain tapped steadily on the umbrella, creating a small cocoon around them. "It's this way." She pointed left when they reached the corner. "I can go alone now." Edward hesitated. "Are you sure? I can walk you a bit closer to home." "No," Grace said firmly. "Mom said not to take strangers to our house." He wanted to protest, to say he wasn't a stranger, that he was her grandfather, but the words stuck in his throat. It wasn't his right. Not yet. "All right," he finally conceded. "But be careful." Grace smiled, revealing a small gap in her front teeth. "Bye, sir." "Thanks again for the cake." And before he could say anything else, she dashed down the street, her red coat a bright blur against the grey rain, until she disappeared around the next corner. Edward remained there, unmoving, one arm still extended with the umbrella now sheltering only himself. He stood like that for a few minutes, staring at the spot where Grace had vanished, as if hoping she might come back. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back into the coffee shop. The bell chimed again as he entered. The place was emptier now. The waitress glanced at him curiously as he sat down at the same table, still warm from Grace's presence. Edward stayed seated, his gaze fixed on the door she'd just used. A profound silence enveloped him, but inside, everything was noise. Memories, images, regrets. He pulled out the photo of Claire once more. His heart ached. He saw the face of his daughter still young, full of hope, before everything was lost because of his rigidity and pride. He remembered the last time he saw her, the harsh words, the way she left without looking back. "You're not going to accept that guy as your husband while you live under my roof. Then I won't live under your roof anymore." Just like that. He watched her pack her things into 2 worn bags. He neither helped nor stopped her. He simply watched, convinced she'd be back when the money ran out, when she realized that her musician boyfriend had no future, when life showed her that Edward was right. She never came back. And now, 5 years later, he learned he was a grandfather, a 4-year-old girl, brave and bright enough to walk alone through the city, a child who had inherited her mother's eyes, that same tilt of the head, that same determination. Silent tears rolled down his cheeks, one after another. He made no effort to hold them back. He cried for the daughter he lost, for the granddaughter he had almost not met, for the family he had helped push away. The pain of the past weighed even more heavily now, yet something inside him began to shift. The pride that had once consumed him seemed small and foolish in light of the chance to reconnect that fate had offered. The rigidity that had shaped his life now seemed like an empty shell, a shield against his true feelings. The waitress came over to ask if he wanted more coffee, but silently withdrew when she saw his tears. Edward didn't notice her. He was lost in thoughts, in the decisions he needed to make, in the path he would choose from now on. He wiped away his tears with the back of his hand and looked again at the photo of Claire. She smiled there, frozen in time, before the distance between them had grown, before the words left unspoken had driven them apart. It was there, in that simple coffee shop with the sound of rain as witness, that Edward made a silent promise, his eyes still wet. He would find Claire. He would look for her, even if she rejected him. He would reconnect with Grace. He would do everything in his power to fix what he had broken with his own hands. He put the photo back in his pocket, left some bills on the table, and stood up. The bell chimed as he stepped into the rainy street, but something had changed. His steps were lighter, his posture more determined. Edward Blake had a mission, and nothing would stop him from fulfilling it. The alarm didn't even need to go off. Edward was already awake well before dawn, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his mind running through the plan for the day. It had been a long night, filled with dreams in which he ran through unknown streets, always glimpsing a red coat turning corners he couldn't reach. By 7 in the morning, he was up. He showered, shaved with unusual care, and chose a shirt Claire had given him for some long-ago birthday. A discreet navy blue, she'd said, brought out his eyes. Maybe it was superstition, but he felt he needed all the luck he could get. He barely touched his breakfast. His stomach was in knots from anticipation. Maybe Grace would show up again at the coffee shop. Maybe it was part of a routine she had while her mother slept after working the night shift. The possibility, faint though it was enough to get him out the door early. The coffee shop opened at 8. Edward arrived at 8:05 to find the place nearly empty. 2 elderly ladies chatted in a corner. A man read the newspaper at the counter. There was no sign of a 4-year-old girl with uneven braids. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," Martha, the waitress, greeted. "Your usual?" "Good morning, Martha. Today I'd like 2 slices of that chocolate cake and 2 glasses of milk, please." She raised her eyebrows, surprised at his change in routine, but said nothing, merely jotted down the order and walked away. Edward chose the same table as the day before, near the window. From there, he had a clear view of the street and the door. He wouldn't miss Grace if she arrived. He arranged the 2 plates invitingly, a silent offering of welcome. The hours began to pass. The sun rose higher, and the light changed hue as it filtered through the window. The coffee was replaced by water. The cake remained untouched. At 10 in the morning, the 2 elderly ladies left. At 11, the man with the newspaper did the same. New customers came in and went, people taking a coffee break, students with laptops, couples taking seats for a brief time before continuing with their day. Edward watched every face, his chest tightening every time the door opened. Each time he spotted a child through the window, he leaned forward, hoping and looking. But none of them was Grace. By noon, the coffee shop filled up again for lunch. Martha approached, concerned. "Are you all right, Mr. Blake? Is the cake not to your liking?" Edward forced a smile. "I'm fine, Martha. I'm waiting for someone." She nodded, a sympathetic look on her lined face. "I see. I'll bring some fresh coffee." He thanked her with a nod. 1:30, 2 o'clock, 3. The lunchtime crowd thinned out once more. The cake started to get crusty on the edges. Edward refused to give up, but with every passing minute, he felt hope slipping through his fingers like fine sand. At 4 in the afternoon, the exact hour he'd met Grace the previous day, his heart began to race. He kept his gaze fixed on the door, as though he could will her into appearing. The bell rang several times. None of them heralded her arrival. "Mr. Blake?" Martha touched his shoulder gently. "We're closing early today, kitchen renovations." Edward looked at her, disoriented, like he was snapping out of a trance. He noticed then that the coffee shop was nearly empty, the employees already cleaning tables. "What time is it?" "Almost 6. He'd lost track of time. 10 hours in the same chair, waiting. 10 hours of hope slowly turning into disappointment. "Sure," he finally responded, rising to his feet. His muscles complained from being still so long. "What do I owe you?" "The cake is on the house," Martha said kindly. "You can take it with you if you'd like." He thanked her but left the slices untouched. He couldn't eat them. Outside, the street looked different than it had the afternoon before. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow on the buildings. Edward walked aimlessly for a few blocks, trying to sort through his thoughts. The city was too large. Grace could be anywhere, Claire as well. Hoping for another random encounter at the coffee shop was foolish, he realized now. He couldn't rely on luck. He had to act. He stopped abruptly on the sidewalk. A discreet sign in the window of a commercial building caught his eye. Randall Investigations, discreet and professional. He stared at the sign for a moment, weighing his options. Was it intrusive? Maybe desperate? Certainly. But the alternative was losing Claire and Grace again, and that he couldn't bear. The next morning, Edward found himself in the modest office of Martin Randall, a middle-aged man with a keen gaze and efficient manners. The investigator listened attentively as Edward explained the situation, omitting only the fact that he hadn't tried to contact his daughter over the last 5 years. Her name is Claire Blake, or she might be using a different surname. This photo is 5 years old. Edward slid the photograph across the desk. She has a daughter named Grace, you're 4 years old, brown hair, usually in 2 braids. Randall examined the photo carefully. And what exactly do you want, Mr. Blake? Just to find them. To know where they live, where they work. Grace mentioned her mom works at a diner, from what I gathered. I understand. And once you find them. Edward hesitated. I just want a chance to get closer, without scaring them, without forcing anything. I want to do things right this time. Randall took notes, asked more questions about their last known locations, mutual friends, any detail that might help in the search. Edward provided what little he knew. I'll need a retainer, the investigator finally said, naming an amount Edward quickly agreed to pay. Leaving the office with the receipt in his pocket and his heart a bit lighter, Edward felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Concrete hope. Not just a vague wish, but an active plan. Autumn was beginning to tinge the city's trees with shades of red and gold. Edward looked up at the sky, enjoying the crisp breeze on his face. Somewhere, not too far away, Claire and Grace were living their lives. Soon, he would find them. The search had begun. The rain had given way to sunny days when Edward's phone rang on Wednesday morning. He answered on the first ring, recognizing Martin Randall's number. I found your daughter, Mr. Blake, the investigator announced without preamble. It wasn't difficult. Edward's heart pounded. He sank into the nearest armchair, his legs suddenly weak. Where? Was all he could manage. She works at a diner called Corner Eats on Westmore Avenue. Waitress on the night shift. Lives 3 blocks away, in a small second-floor apartment in an older building. Edward closed his eyes, taking it in. So close. She had been so close the entire time. And the girl. Grace goes to a public daycare part of the day. In the afternoons, she usually stays with an elderly neighbor while her mom starts her shift. Seems like a pretty independent kid. Well cared for, Royce, given the circumstances. The circumstances. Those words stung Edward. He knew exactly what they meant. A single mother, struggling to get by, no family support. Thank you, Mr. Randall. Send me the full report and your final invoice. After he hung up, Edward remained still for a long time. The information he'd longed for was now within reach. The path to Claire and Grace was open, but now he faced the fear of taking that next step. He picked up Claire's photo from the coffee table, where he kept it. He studied her smile, trying to imagine how she looked now, 5 years later. More tired, certainly. With worry lines she shouldn't have. Would she still have that determined look in her eye? Would she still smile as easily? He spent the whole day pacing around the house, restless. 3 times he tried to leave, even stepping as far as the door, only to turn back and sit down again. He rehearsed dialogues in his mind, practiced apologies, imagined every possible reaction, from emotional hugs to a door slammed in his face. Night fell without him making a decision. He slept poorly, plagued by fragmented dreams with faces morphing and voices calling to him from afar. The next morning, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. He wouldn't go straight to the diner or the apartment. It felt too invasive. but he could at least see the area, get a feel for the environment where Claire and Grace were living their lives without him. He dressed carefully, dark pants, a simple blue shirt, a light blazer. He wanted to look respectable but not intimidating. In the mirror, he saw a man aged by regret, eyes carrying the weight of wrong choices. Westmore Avenue was only a 20-minute drive from his house. He parked a few blocks away and walked, trying to steady his breathing. The neighborhood was modest but pleasant. Small shops, a pharmacy, a newsstand, ordinary people living ordinary lives. He spotted the Corner Eats diner across the street, a simple place with a faded red awning protecting a few outdoor tables. He resisted the urge to go in. He wasn't ready to see Claire like this unannounced at her workplace. Instead, he kept walking, taking in every detail of the area, imagining Grace playing on these sidewalks, Claire shopping in these stores. He turned right down a side street, then left, with no clear destination. That's when he saw her. Sitting on the concrete steps in front of a small apartment building was Grace. She wore a simple yellow dress and cradled a ragged cloth doll with fraying yarn hair. Her own hair, loose that day, spilled over her shoulders in messy curls. She seemed absorbed in a private conversation with the doll. Edward stopped in his tracks, frozen by the unexpected sight. He hadn't planned to meet Grace first. He wasn't prepared. He considered retreating, leaving before she noticed him. Too late. Grace lifted her eyes, perhaps sensing his gaze. For a moment, her little face reflected confusion, trying to recall where she'd seen him. Then, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Cake Man!" she exclaimed, smiling to reveal the gap in her front teeth. Edward's heart warmed at that simple nickname. All his anxiety and fear seemed to lessen before the genuine joy of that child. "Hello, Grace," he replied, finding his voice despite the lump in his throat. "Did you come to visit me?" she asked, curiosity shining in her big eyes. "I was just walking around the neighborhood," Edward answered, approaching carefully. "It's quite a coincidence to find you here." "I live there," she pointed to the building behind her, "on the second floor, the window with the blue curtain." Edward looked in the direction she indicated, feeling a pang in his chest. So close. She had been so close the entire time. "May I sit down?" he asked, indicating the space beside her on the steps. Grace nodded, shifting so he'd have more room. "This is Lily," she said, introducing the ragged cloth doll. "She's my best friend." "Nice to meet you, Lily," Edward responded earnestly, extending his hand as if to shake the doll's. Grace giggled, delighted by the gesture. She moved the doll's hand to shake his. "You never came back to the coffee shop," Grace noted, sounding slightly accusatory. "I did go back, you just didn't show up," Edward corrected softly. "Oh." She pondered this. "Mom found out I went out alone. She said it's dangerous. Now I'm only allowed to go to the bakery on the corner." Edward felt both relief and sadness. Relief that Claire was taking good care of her daughter. Sadness that he might have lost his chance to see Grace again by accident. "Your mom is right. It's dangerous for a little girl to walk alone in the city." Grace shrugged, as though danger was too abstract a concept to concern her much. "Why are you here by yourself?" Edward asked, glancing around. "Mrs. Martha is taking a nap," she explained, pointing to the first floor. "She watches me when Mom's working, but she's very old and always sleeps after lunch." Edward made a mental note that Grace's supervision wasn't very strict. "Did you bring cake?" Grace asked hopefully, noticing his empty hands. Edward laughed. "Not today, but we can go get some if you'd like." Her eyes lit up, but she hesitated. "I can't leave. Mrs. Martha will worry if she wakes up and I'm gone." He nodded, respecting her sense of responsibility. "Some other time, then." They fell silent for a moment, watching a cat cross the street with casual elegance. "Why are you really here?" Grace asked suddenly, fixing Edward with a surprising intensity for one so young. The question caught him off guard again. He hesitated, trying to find an answer that was truthful but not frightening. "I'm looking for something important that I lost," he said at last. "Something that means a lot to me." Grace seemed to accept that. "I lose things sometimes. Mom says I'm too distracted." "And do you find what you lose?" "Almost always," she answered confidently. "If you look hard enough, you end up finding it." A smile appeared on Edward's lips. The simple wisdom of this child was exactly what he needed to hear. "You're right, Grace. If we look hard enough, we eventually find it." They continued chatting, jumping from topic to topic in the way only children can. Edward listened, fascinated by every word, every story, every small glimpse of the life she and Claire had built. It was a simple reunion, sitting there on those concrete steps in the mild afternoon sun. But to Edward, it was loaded with meaning. A beginning, a promise, a path back home. The late afternoon sun was softening when a door slammed inside the building. Grace clutched her rag doll more tightly. "That's Mrs. Martha," she whispered conspiratorially. "She always slams the doors when she wakes up from her nap." Edward nodded seriously, participating in the silent conspiracy. A few minutes later, a grey-haired lady with a kindly face appeared in the building's entrance, adjusting her glasses on her nose. "Grace, I was worried," she said, her tone more relieved than scolding. "Oh, I didn't know you had company." The girl stood up, holding Lily by her worn hand. "This is the cake man, Mrs. Martha. He bought me chocolate cake at the coffee shop." The woman gave Edward an assessing look. He also stood, extending his hand politely. "Edward Blake. I met Grace by chance last week." "Martha Wilson?" she replied, shaking his hand with surprising firmness. "I'm Claire's neighbor. I look after this young lady when her mother's at work." Edward noticed the protective tone. Martha clearly cared about both Grace and Claire. "Are you a relative?" she asked, still suspicious. The question hung in the air. Relative, yes, he was. Grandfather, father, family, words he felt he'd lost the right to use. "A friend," he finally answered. "Just a friend." Martha seemed to accept that response, though her eyes indicated she'd stay alert. "Grace, dear, your mum will be here soon for lunch before her shift," she said, checking her watch. "We should go upstairs to brush that hair, don't you think?" "Mum's coming for lunch?" Grace's eyes lit up. "Can I wait here?" The older woman hesitated, glancing at Edward. He felt the weight of her scrutiny. "We promise we'll stay right here on the steps," he assured her, "where you can see us." Martha considered for a moment. "All right, Claire should be here in about 20 minutes. I'll be watching from my window," she added, a veiled warning in her voice. When they were alone again, Grace sat back down, swinging her legs to some imagined tune. "Did you know my mom works nearby?" she asked, smoothing her yellow dress. "It's a little diner with red tables. Sometimes she brings me dessert." Edward's heart raced. Claire would be there in 20 minutes. The reality of an imminent reunion hit him hard. "It must be a nice place," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "It is. Sometimes there's a man who plays guitar, and there's a cat that sits in the window," Grace continued, oblivious to Edward's tumult. "Mom says when I'm bigger, I can help serve the tables." "Would you like that?" Edward asked, genuinely curious to learn more about his granddaughter. Grace shrugged. "Maybe. But I also want to be an astronaut, or a veterinarian." "Or a princess," Edward smiled. "You can be anything you want." "That's what Mom said," she exclaimed, as if he had passed a secret test. The conversation flowed naturally. Grace spoke about her world with the simplicity of childhood, stories about school, about Lily, about the bird that built a nest in the tree in front of the building. Edward listened to every word, storing them as precious treasures. "That's my mom!" Grace suddenly pointed to a figure approaching at the end of the street. Edward followed her gaze and felt as if the world had stopped turning. Claire, his daughter. She walked quickly, her hair in a practical ponytail, wearing simple jeans and a light blue blouse. Even from a distance, he recognized her determined posture, the slight tilt of her head Grace had inherited. "Mom!" Grace shouted, waving enthusiastically. Claire smiled and waved back, picking up her pace. Only when she got closer did she notice Edward sitting beside her daughter. Her smile froze, her steps faltered. For a second, it looked as if she might turn around and run away. Edward stood slowly, as though any sudden move would scare her off. He felt his heart hammering in his chest. Claire looked older, yes, but not in the way he had feared. There was a strength in her that hadn't been there 5 years ago. Worry lines framed her eyes, but her gaze was more certain, more resolute. "Hi, Mom," Grace hopped off the step, running to hug her mother. "Look who I found, the cake man." Claire hugged her daughter automatically, but her eyes never left Edward's face. A storm of emotions played across her features: shock, confusion, anger, fear. "Grace," she said finally, her voice controlled, "why don't you go see if Mrs. Martha needs help with that recipe she was making?" The girl looked from Claire to Edward, sensing the tension but too young to understand it fully. "But you just got here," she protested. "Just for a minute, sweetheart. I need to talk to this man." Grace hesitated, but then nodded. "Okay, but don't take too long. Lunch is spaghetti today." She ran up the steps, her rag doll bobbing in her hand. When the door closed behind Grace, the silence between father and daughter became almost tangible. They stood only a few feet apart, but there was a chasm between them. "What are you doing here?" Claire finally asked, her voice low but firm. Edward drew a deep breath. This was the moment he'd prepared for, rehearsed, dreaded. "I ran into Grace by chance last week at a coffee shop," he began, choosing his words carefully. She saw your photo. She recognized you." Claire folded her arms, a defensive posture Edward knew well. "So you found out you have a granddaughter, and now you want to walk into our lives like nothing happened?" Her question was hard but fair. Edward felt the weight of every word. "No," he answered honestly. "I don't have that right. I just wanted to see you, know how you are, tell you I'm sorry." Claire let out a bitter laugh. 5 years later, because it's convenient for you now. It's exactly like that," she interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "You threw me out, said you were ashamed of me, that I'd ruined my life, and now you're here on my doorstep." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of guilt nearly crushing him. Every word she said was true, every accusation deserved. "I was wrong," he said simply, "as wrong as a man can be." Claire stared at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For a moment, Edward saw the girl she'd been, the one who used to run into his arms when she had nightmares, the teenager who hugged him after swim meets, the young woman who once trusted him to guide her. "You have no idea what I went through," she said, her voice softer now, laden with old pain. "Pregnant, alone, no money, no family. Jason left me 2 weeks after I moved out. You were right about him, at least." Edward took a hesitant step toward her. "Claire, No." She raised her hand to stop him. "I don't want to hear it. Not now. I have to go upstairs. Grace is waiting." She started to turn back toward the building's entrance. Desperation flared inside Edward. She was slipping away again, and this time it could be for good. "It was the biggest mistake of my life letting you leave," he blurted, words spilling out in a rush. "Not a day goes by that I don't regret it. Not a night goes by that I don't wake up thinking of you, wondering where you are, if you're okay." Claire paused, her back still turned to him. Her tense shoulders betrayed an inner conflict. "Your mother died," Edward continued, his voice breaking. 2 years ago, cancer. It happened too fast for us to prepare. Her last request was for me to find you, for us to make peace. I failed her too. I couldn't find you in time." Slowly, Claire turned around, tears silently streaming down her face. The news of her mother's death hit her like a physical blow. "Mom died," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Edward nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in his throat. For a long moment, father and daughter stood there, separated by years of hurt and silence, united only by the shared pain. "Why didn't you look for me sooner?" Claire finally asked. "Pride," he said, the brutal truth coming out. "Stupid, foolish pride. I thought you'd come back when you realized you'd made a mistake, when you needed help. It took me too long to realize I was the one who was wrong." Claire dried her tears with the back of her hand, a gesture so like Grace's that Edward's heart ached. "So what do you want from us now?" she asked. The question hung between them, laden with possibilities and dangers. "A chance," he answered simply, "to get to know my granddaughter, to help you, if you'll let me, to try to fix what I broke." Claire took a deep breath, looking older and more tired than her 27 years justified. "It's not that simple. You can't just appear and expect me to welcome you with open arms. I know. Grace is my priority, I won't let her get hurt. Neither will I, Edward promised. Never. Claire studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for something in his familiar features that might guide her decision. I'll give you a chance, she finally said, her words carefully measured. One, but you have to prove you've changed, that you're not the same man who threw me out. The relief Edward felt was so overwhelming his legs nearly gave out. Thank you, was all he could say. I'm not doing this for you, Claire clarified. I'm doing it for Grace. She deserves to know her grandfather. And for Mom, it's what she would have wanted. Edward nodded, understanding the unstated conditions of the deal. I work at a diner a couple of blocks from here, Claire continued, gesturing in that direction. Corner Eats. My shift starts at 2 today. Come by around 4. We can talk during my break. I'll be there. Claire hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but then simply nodded briefly and turned toward the building. Edward remained on the sidewalk, watching the door close behind her. The conversation had been brief, painful, but it contained something he had not dared hope for. A promise, a chance, a possibility. In the second-floor window, he saw Grace's little face appear, waving excitedly. He waved back, a surge of gratitude flooding him so strongly it almost brought him to his knees. The path would be long and hard. Claire's trust would not be easily regained. The broken bonds would not be mended overnight. But for the first time in 5 years, Edward Blake felt he was moving in the right direction, toward family, toward redemption, toward home. The rain tapped gently against the window of the small apartment. Claire finished washing the dinner dishes, while Grace, seated at the kitchen table, colored the drawing she'd started earlier with intense focus. The sound of pencils scratching paper mixed with the clinking plates and the distant rumble of thunder. 3 weeks had passed since Edward's reappearance. 3 weeks of cautious meetings, measured conversations, small steps toward a reconciliation that still felt fragile and uncertain. Edward had visited the diner a few times, taken Grace to the park twice, always with Claire's prior permission, slowly inching his way into their world. The girl hummed quietly as she drew, occasionally furrowing her brow, switching pencils, tilting her head to evaluate her work. Through the reflection in the window over the sink, Claire watched her, a gentle smile on her lips. Moments like these were precious, quiet, simple, perfect in their small, everyday way. Finished, Grace finally declared, lifting the drawing in both hands to examine it better. Claire dried her hands on a towel and came closer. Let me see, honey. The drawing depicted 3 figures holding hands, a woman with long hair, a small girl in the middle, and a taller man with grey hair. Above them was a smiling sun and blue clouds. Below, scrawled in uneven letters, My family. Claire felt a lump in her throat. The man in the drawing was clearly Edward. It's beautiful, Grace, she said, keeping her voice steady. It's you, me, and Grandpa Edward, Grace explained, pointing to each figure. We're at the park. So I'm going to give it to him next time he visits us. Claire slowly sat down in the chair beside her daughter, Grandpa Edward. The ease with which Grace used the term caught her off guard. Of course the girl would make the connection eventually, but hearing it aloud made everything more real. Grace, she began, choosing her words carefully. Do you like Grandpa Edward? The question hung in the air for a moment. Grace considered it with the solemnity only children can give adult questions. Yes, she finally answered. He tells cool stories, and he really listens to me, like you do. Claire nodded, taking in her daughter's sincere response. Listening, something Edward had never been particularly good at before. Perhaps he really had changed. Mum, Grace looked up from the drawing, her face suddenly serious. Why didn't you ever talk about him, about Grandpa? The direct, innocent question hit Claire like a punch. How could she explain years of hurt, rejection, and silence to a 4-year-old? How to sum up the complexity of a broken family tie? Claire gently touched her daughter's messy curls, gaining time to organize her thoughts. Sometimes, she began slowly, people who love each other can still hurt each other, even without meaning to. Grace frowned, trying to understand. Like when I accidentally broke your necklace. A bit like that, yes, but also different. Claire offered a small smile. When I was younger, before you were born, Grandpa Edward and I had a big disagreement. We got really sad and angry with each other. Why? Claire sighed. How could she simplify years of frustration, disappointment, and the final fight that led to her leaving home? We disagreed on some important thing, she explained. I wanted to go one way, and he wanted me to go another. We were both stubborn, and neither of us knew how to talk about it properly. Grace looked deeply thoughtful. Was it because of my dad? She asked suddenly, surprising Claire with her insight. Partly, Claire admitted, seeing little point in lying. Your dad and we met at a complicated time. Grandpa thought he wasn't right for me. Was he right? Grace's question sounded remarkably mature for someone so young. Claire hesitated. How to answer without belittling Grace's absent father or lying to her, without making things more complicated. Your dad had different dreams than mine, she finally said. He wanted to travel, see new places, follow his own path. He wasn't ready for a family. He wasn't ready for me, Grace concluded, lowering her gaze to the drawing. Claire's heart twisted. She gently lifted her daughter's chin, forcing her to look into her eyes. Listen to me, Grace. You are the best thing that ever happened in my life, the most important. If I could go back in time, I'd do everything exactly the same, because in the end I got you. Grace smiled shyly, the sparkle returning to her eyes. Then why did you and Grandpa stay apart for so long? She returned to her original question. Claire sighed, seeking the right words, because sometimes pride makes it hard to apologize, and hurt makes it hard to forgive, even when you want to. Your grandpa and we both made mistakes. But now he's back, Grace noted, a simple statement of fact. Yes, Claire said softly. He's back. The girl seemed satisfied with that answer. She looked down at her drawing again, running a finger over the figure of her grandfather, as though memorizing the details. I like him, she said simply. He listens to me and doesn't treat me like a baby. We can keep seeing him, right? Please. The question, delivered with so much hope in her big eyes, touched Claire deeply. Despite all her reservations, all her scars, she couldn't deny her daughter the chance to know her grandfather, to have a larger family than just the two of them. Yes, she answered, her voice unsteady. We can keep seeing him. The smile that lit up Grace's face said more than 1,000 words. She leapt from her chair and hugged her mother tightly, wrapping her small arms around Claire's neck. Thank you, Mom, she said, planting a big, slightly sticky kiss on Claire's cheek. Then, as quickly as the embrace began, Grace returned to her drawing, adding more details to the sky, completely absorbed in her task. Claire watched her daughter, marveling at how children can accept, forgive, and move forward without the weight of the past, without the complicated baggage adults carry. Grace's innocence wasn't ignorance. It was a form of wisdom Claire had lost long ago. Maybe it was time to relearn. Outside, the rain began to let up. A stubborn ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, creating a faint rainbow in the distance. Claire saw it through the kitchen window and allowed herself a small smile, a symbol of promise after a storm, of new beginnings. For the first time in a long time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, things could really turn out all right. The season was changing slowly. The autumn rains gave way to cooler mornings and gentle mist that covered the streets in the early hours. The trees along the avenue lost their leaves, forming a golden-red carpet on the sidewalks. Time passed, as it always does, marking with subtlety the start of a new phase. The first official visit took place on a Saturday. Edward arrived promptly at 2 in the afternoon, as agreed. He carried a small package wrapped in colorful paper, handling it almost too carefully. When Claire opened the door, she noticed he had gotten a haircut and chosen less formal clothes, jeans and a simple blue shirt under a light jacket, a conscious effort to appear more approachable, less intimidating. "Thank you for letting me do this," he said, still standing in the doorway as though afraid to cross an invisible boundary without explicit invitation. Claire nodded, stepping aside so he could enter. "Grace is excited. She's been talking about you all week." The small apartment was modest but cozy, used furniture chosen carefully, a few plants on the windowsills, Grace's drawings taped to the fridge. It was a real home, built with effort and love. "Grandpa!" Grace's cheerful voice came from the hallway, and in the next instant she was rushing toward Edward, hair loose and bouncing. He instinctively crouched to meet her, but hesitated, unsure if he should hug her. Grace had no such reservations. She threw herself into his arms with the absolute confidence only a child can have. "I brought you a present," Edward said when they finally pulled apart. He offered the brightly wrapped package, which Grace accepted with shining eyes. "Can I open it now, Mom?" she asked, looking at Claire. "Of course, honey." With eager fingers, Grace tore off the paper, revealing an illustrated storybook. The title read, "Princesses Who Rescue Dragons," in colorful letters. "You said you liked brave princesses," Edward explained when Grace looked up at him in surprise. "It's perfect," she exclaimed, flipping through the brightly colored illustrations. "Will you read it to me?" A quick glance at Claire for permission, a discreet nod granting it. Small gestures that set the unwritten rules of this new arrangement. "I'd be delighted," Edward replied, and so it began, with a story about unconventional princesses, read aloud in the small living room. Claire watched from the kitchen as she prepared a snack, keeping enough distance to give them space, but close enough to hear every word. When the story ended and the cookies were served, Grace asked, "Can we go to the park, please? I want to show Grandpa the ducks." Another exchange of looks between Claire and Edward, another silent negotiation. "All right," Claire relented, "but be back before dark." At the park, Edward watched Grace feed the ducks with bits of stale bread. Her enthusiasm was so natural that it both enchanted and saddened him. How many other children were out there? How many other small moments like this had he missed? "They're a family," Grace explained, pointing to a particular group of ducks. "That big one is the dad, that one is the mom, and the tiny ones are their babies." "How do you know?" Edward asked, genuinely curious about her reasoning. "Because they're always together," she said with a child's irrefutable logic. "Families stay together." Her words hung in the air, carrying more meaning than she could possibly understand. Edward felt the sting of them, an unintentional, gentle rebuke. "Not always," he said softly. "Sometimes families are apart for a while." Grace considered that, tossing the last piece of bread to the ducks. "But they can come back together," she concluded at last, looking at him. "Like us, right?" Edward felt a lump in his throat. "Yes," he managed. "Like us." And the following weeks developed a pattern. Edward visited on Saturdays, sometimes during the week when Claire worked the night shift. Mrs. Martha, initially wary, gradually accepted his presence, especially after he fixed her leaking faucet and replaced a blown-out hallway light. His time with Grace had a special quality, unlike anything he'd experienced before. There was a purity in their relationship, free from the complexities and expectations that had overshadowed his role as a father. With Grace, he learned to be present, to truly listen, to engage with her world without trying to mold it to his own ideas. One day in early November, he took her to see the decorated store windows downtown. Grace walked beside him, her small hand firmly grasping his, commenting on everything she saw with infinite wonder. "Look, Grandpa, a train that moves by itself," she exclaimed, pointing to a display where a miniature train chugged through tiny mountains and villages. "Grandpa." The word still surprised him each time he heard it, bringing both joy at her acceptance and sadness for the years lost. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" he offered, noticing how the cold wind had turned Grace's cheeks pink. In a cozy coffee shop, Edward watched his granddaughter carefully sip from her mug, leaving a foam mustache on her upper lip. There was something mesmerizing about how fully she lived in each moment, unconcerned about past or future. "Your mum liked hot chocolate too, when she was your age," he commented. Grace looked at him with renewed interest. "Really? Mum was like me?" "In many ways, yes." She had the same curious eyes, the same way of furrowing her brow when she was focused. "Tell me more," Grace said, settling into her chair. "What was Mom like when she was little?" Edward smiled, delving into memories he'd long kept hidden. He told stories of Claire as a child, how she collected colored stones, built forts with bed sheets, and insisted on keeping a frog as a pet. Mom wanted a frog, Grace laughed, delighted by the thought. Oh yes, and not just any frog, it had to be green with golden spots. We searched every pond around, but never found one just like it. The stories flowed, creating an invisible bridge between past and present. For Grace, they were magical tales about a version of her mother she'd never known. For Edward, they were precious fragments of a life he'd let slip away, now recovered through his granddaughter. On a rainy afternoon, they stayed at the apartment. Edward brought paper, colored pencils, paints, and brushes. They spread everything out on the kitchen table and started drawing. "What are you drawing?" Grace asked, craning her neck to see his sketch. "A house," Edward replied, outlining a roof. "The house where your mom grew up." "It's huge," Grace observed, impressed. "It was a great place for a kid. It had a backyard with trees to climb and a swing hanging from the oldest oak." Grace dipped her brush in blue paint and began coloring the sky on her own drawing. "Why don't you and Mom live there anymore?" The question, so simple and direct, caught Edward off guard. Before he could reply, Claire entered the kitchen carrying a basket of laundry. "Because sometimes people need different spaces," she answered, surprising Edward. "They need room to grow in different ways." Their eyes met for a brief moment. There was something new in Claire's gaze. Not complete forgiveness, perhaps, but the beginning of understanding. "Grandpa's teaching me how to draw houses," Grace announced, oblivious to the subtle tension in the air. "I see," Claire smiled, setting the basket on the counter. "He's always been good at that. He used to draw houses for work, you know." "Really?" Grace looked at her grandfather with renewed admiration. "You used to draw real houses?" "Yes, I was an architect," Edward confirmed, pleasantly surprised that Claire would share this information. "I drew buildings and houses, sometimes even schools." "Wow," Grace was genuinely impressed. "Can you show me how to draw a really tall building?" As Edward guided Grace's small hand, teaching her how to make straight lines and place windows, Claire lingered for a moment, watching them. There was pain in her expression, but also something else, a reluctant acceptance of the new reality taking shape. Later, when Grace was asleep and Edward was about to leave, Claire offered him a cup of coffee. They sat at the kitchen table in uncomfortable silence at first, until Edward finally spoke. "Thank you for today." "For all of this?" Claire stirred her spoon in her cup, the tink of metal against porcelain echoing in the quiet. "I'm not doing this for you," she reminded him, but her tone was less defensive. "Grace deserves to know her grandpa." "I know, but still, thank you." Another silence, but now different, less charged. "She takes after you," Edward observed. "She has your determination," Claire almost smiled, "and your stubbornness. It runs in the family, I'm afraid," he admitted, allowing himself a slight grin too. For a brief moment, the chasm between them seemed just a little smaller. That December arrived with its lights and festive decorations. Edward began stopping by the apartment 3 times a week. He became a steady presence, reliable, patient, attentive. He fixed small things that broke, brought ingredients for special recipes, read bedtime stories to Grace. Claire watched the transformation with cautious acceptance. The man now sitting on the floor solving jigsaw puzzles with her daughter was different from the rigid, controlling father she remembered. There was a gentleness, a vulnerability he'd never shown before. One afternoon, picking Grace up from daycare, Claire was surprised to see Edward already there, chatting with the teacher. "I thought you had to work late," he explained, clearly worried he might have overstepped. "I just wanted to help." "It's fine," Claire responded, surprised to realize she meant it. His presence didn't unsettle her the way it once had. They walked home together, Grace in between, holding each of their hands and occasionally hopping over sidewalk cracks. "Grace showed me her drawing today," Edward said, "the one for the school play." "She's excited," Claire smiled. "She practices her lines every night before bed." "Could I?" Edward hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Would you mind if I came to watch it, if that's okay with you?" Claire studied his face. The request was simple but packed with meaning. Another step toward a family routine they had never truly experienced. "Grace would like that," she finally answered. Not exactly a yes, but close enough. That night, after Grace fell asleep, having insisted on one more bedtime story, Claire found Edward in the living room, looking at the framed photos on the wall. There were pictures of Grace as a baby, her first steps, birthdays, precious moments he hadn't been there for. "I'm sorry," he said, without turning around, "for everything I missed, for everything I made you miss." Claire folded her arms, an automatic defensive posture. "We can't change the past." "No," Edward agreed, turning to face her. "But we can choose the future we want to build." His words hovered between them, an offer, a possibility. "I want you to know," he continued, voice firmer now, "that I'm here, not just for Grace, for you too. Whatever you need, whatever she needs, you can count on me." "Don't make promises you can't keep," Claire warned, the old fear of abandonment surfacing briefly. "I'm not promising anything I can't give," Edward replied simply. "My presence, my support, my love, if one day you can accept it again." Claire didn't answer, but something in her stance shifted. A slight ease, a small nod of acknowledgement. "Grandpa," Grace called, running into the living room with wet hair and unicorn pajamas. "Are you still here for my bedtime story?" "If your mom says it's okay," Edward responded, glancing at Claire. "You can stay," she said, and there was a new note in her voice. Not complete forgiveness, not yet, but an open door where once there had been only walls. The park glistened under a thin layer of frost on a Sunday morning. Grace ran ahead, chasing dry leaves the wind occasionally lifted from the ground. Edward and Claire walked a few steps behind, always keeping her in sight. "She asked about Christmas," Claire said, adjusting her scarf against the cold. "What did you tell her?" "That we'd do something small, just the two of us, like always." Edward nodded, sensing delicate territory. "If you'd like," he began after a moment, "my house has plenty of space. Maybe we could do something together. Nothing fancy, just family." Family. The words still felt strange between them. "I'll think about it," Claire answered, neither accepting nor rejecting. Up ahead, Grace had discovered a small patch of snow left over from the night's frost. She gathered it carefully, shaping what looked more like a misshapen ball than a snowman. "Grandpa, help me make a snowman," she shouted, beckoning excitedly. Edward hurried over, always ready to meet his granddaughter's requests. He knelt beside her, ignoring the cold biting through his jeans. "I think we need more snow, sweetheart," he remarked, evaluating the insufficient mound. "We can use leaves too," Grace suggested, with the resourcefulness of children. "We just have to pretend they're snow." Edward laughed, charmed by her solution. "You're very clever, you know that." "Mom says I take after Grandpa," Grace replied, intent on gathering more leaves. The statement caught him off guard. He looked at Claire, who stood a few paces back, watching them. She shrugged, as if to say, "She hears everything." Together, grandfather and granddaughter built a snowman, mainly out of leaves, twigs, and an old scarf Edward offered to complete the work. It looked nothing like a real snowman, but to Grace, it was perfect. "Let's show Mom," she exclaimed, grabbing Edward's hand and tugging him toward Claire. "It's the best leaf snowman I've ever seen," Claire said with mock seriousness, making Grace jump with joy. Edward watched them with a full heart. Grace stood between them, a living link, reconnecting them, giving them a second chance to be a family. That night, as Edward read Grace a bedtime story, she stopped him halfway through a page and gazed at him with those eyes that seemed to see far beyond her 4 years. "Grandpa," she said solemnly, "you're going to stay with us forever, aren't you?" Such a simple, complicated question made Edward pause. He glanced up to see Claire standing in the doorway, listening. "I can't promise forever," he answered honestly. "No one can, sweetheart, but I can promise that while I'm here, I'll give you and your mom all the love I have." Grace seemed satisfied with that reply. She snuggled closer and asked him to continue reading. Later, as he was leaving, Edward found Claire on the small building's porch, looking at the sky, where a few stars managed to shine despite the city lights. "She's getting attached to you," Claire commented, her gaze still fixed on the stars. "And I'm attached to her," Edward replied simply. A comfortable silence settled between them. There was no longer a desperate need to fill empty spaces with words, just mutual acceptance that all three were on a journey together. "Good night, Claire," Edward finally said, stepping down the first stair. "Good night, Dad," she replied, the word emerging hesitantly, almost a whisper. Dad. She hadn't used that term in 5 years. It was just a word, but it held the weight of the transformation unfolding between them. Edward descended the remaining steps with a lightness in his stride, his heart full of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine hope. Their bonds were growing, strengthening day by day, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through small, genuine, real moments. With Grace calling him Grandpa as they built sandcastles in the park, with Claire allowing herself to use the word Dad again, with a promise, not of perfection, but of presence. A family rebuilding itself, one day at a time. Winter had fully settled over the city. The trees, now leafless, stood out against the grey sky like delicate silhouettes. The cold air made every breath visible, tiny white clouds that vanished quickly. The streets took on a special hush, as if the entire world was speaking in whispers. It was Saturday. Edward had taken Grace to the Natural Science Museum, a promise he'd made weeks earlier when she'd shown an interest in dinosaurs after reading a book together. They spent the entire morning there, admiring huge skeletons, mysterious fossils, and detailed dioramas of long-gone worlds. Grace was especially enchanted with the interactive exhibit, where she could excavate fossils in a specially designed sandbox. Armed with a little brush and wearing a souvenir explorer's hat Edward had bought at the gift shop, she worked with single-minded concentration. "Look, Grandpa, I found a T-Rex tooth," she cried, holding up a plaster mold with immense satisfaction. "Amazing, my little scientist," Edward replied, snapping a photo with his phone. He'd send it to Claire later, as he often did during his outings with Grace. They ate lunch in the museum café, sandwiches, juice, and a slice of chocolate cake they shared. Grace chattered non-stop, soaking up information like a sponge and forming her own theories about what dinosaurs were really like. "I think Tyrannosaurus Rex was rainbow-colored," she declared. "The books show him as green or brown, but I bet he was cooler than that," Edward grinned. "Scientists recently discovered that many dinosaurs actually had colorful feathers. Maybe you're right." Her eyes widened. "I knew it. I'll tell Mom." After the museum, they walked through the nearby park. Grace insisted on collecting especially pretty leaves and interesting little rocks for her treasure box. Edward watched her with a mix of joy and sadness. Over the last few months, every moment with his granddaughter had become precious to him. Every laugh was a gift, every curious question a blessing. Their bond felt natural, effortless, as though they'd always been in each other's lives. With Claire, things progressed more slowly. They had moments of closeness, honest conversations, even shared laughter at times. But they also had heavy silences, unspoken reminders of wounds not entirely healed. Edward respected that pace, aware that genuine reconciliation can't be rushed. As the sky darkened, hinting at the possibility of snowfall, they decided to head back. Grace, tired but happy, fell asleep in the car, still holding her explorer hat and T-Rex tooth. "I guess we wore out our little paleontologist," Edward commented softly, turning up the heat. It was nearly 5 in the afternoon when they parked in front of the small apartment building. Taking care not to wake her, Edward carried Grace up to the second floor, a small backpack of her treasures slung over his shoulder. Claire opened the door before they even knocked, as if she'd been waiting by the window. "Looks like someone had quite a day," she remarked quietly, smiling as she saw her sleeping daughter. "We explored the age of dinosaurs," Edward explained, stepping into the warm apartment. She never stopped for a second. With gentle coordination, they moved down the narrow hallway to Grace's room. Edward laid her on the bed while Claire removed her shoes. They worked in silent harmony, like a dance they had somehow practiced for years. The explorer hat went on the bedside table. The T-Rex tooth remained clutched in her small hand, even in sleep. "I promised she could start a collection," Edward whispered, explaining her attachment to the item. Claire just nodded, pulling the blanket over Grace. For a moment, they stood side by side, watching her sleep. There was something almost sacred in that simple domestic scene, a peace Edward never thought he deserved, but was profoundly grateful for. Back in the living room, Claire offered him a cup of coffee. He accepted, though normally he would have declined this late. He had something to say, something he'd been rehearsing in his mind for weeks. Maybe now was the right time. The kitchen was small but cozy. A vase of fresh flowers decorated the round table covered with a striped cloth. On the walls, more of Grace's drawings, many depicting three figures holding hands: mother, daughter, and grandfather. Claire prepared the coffee with practiced movements. The familiar aroma filled the room. When they finally sat down, face to face, Edward noticed how she seemed less tense around him than in those early visits. She looked gentler, as though the harshest edges of her hurt had begun to soften with time. "She had a wonderful day," Claire said, breaking the silence. "The photos you sent, she looked so happy." "She's an extraordinary child," Edward replied. "So curious, so full of life." "Yes, she is," Claire smiled, proud. Another silence fell, this one not uncomfortable. It felt almost companionable, like a pause to breathe between two people learning each other's language again. Edward turned his cup in his hands, staring into the dark liquid. It was now or never. "Claire," he began, voice lower than intended. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said before, but I never found the right time." She lifted her gaze, instantly alert. A shadow of worry crossed her face. "What is it? Did something happen?" "No, nothing recent," he quickly reassured her. "It's about your mom." The mention of Eleanor made Claire straighten up. Edward rarely spoke of his wife, and Claire never asked. It was a name that hovered between them, unspoken but always present. "What about her?" she asked, her voice controlled. Edward took a deep breath, steeling himself. "She passed away a little over a year ago, pancreatic cancer." The words fell heavily. Claire blinked several times, as if struggling to absorb the information. Her fingers clenched around the cup. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first, I thought it would be too much. You were already dealing with my sudden reappearance," and he paused, searching for the right words. "Then, I didn't know how to bring it up. How to tell you she was gone and you'd never have the chance to—" He couldn't finish, there was no need. Claire lowered her head, a single tear tracing her cheek. "Did she suffer?" she asked after a moment. "It happened quickly," Edward said gently. "Less than 3 months between diagnosis and the end. The doctors said it was too aggressive, already spread when we found out." Claire nodded silently, taking in the news. Edward saw the internal battle on her face, the grief of loss mingled with regret for the lost years, all the unspoken words, the shared moments that would never happen. "Did she talk about me?" Claire asked, eyes filled with tears. "Every day," Edward confirmed, his own voice faltering. "She never stopped loving you, Claire, never stopped hoping." Another tear joined the first. This time, Claire made no effort to hold back. "In her final days," Edward continued, "when she was very weak, she made me promise something. Her last wish was that I find you, that we reconcile." His voice broke on the last word. The guilt he carried felt heavier than ever. "I promised her, but I waited too long. Pride, fear. I don't know. I failed her, just like I failed you." Without warning, Claire reached across the table and took his hand. The simple, kind gesture startled Edward. He looked at her fingers resting on his, a gesture that seemed to contain an entire universe of meaning. "You're here now," she said gently. "That's what matters." Edward couldn't hold back his own tears. They flowed silently, tracing the lines on his face etched deeper by lonely years. "Forgive me, Claire," he whispered, voice raw. "For everything. For letting you walk out that door." She gripped his hand a bit tighter. "I already have," she replied, her voice unsteady with emotion. "I didn't realize until now, but I forgave you some time ago." Something broke between them in that moment, not destructively, but as a release, like an old dam finally giving way, letting pent-up waters flow their natural course. Tears that had waited years to be shed, words that had waited years to be spoken. They stayed like that for a long time, hands clasped across the kitchen table, united by their love for a woman who was no longer there, and a child sleeping in the next room. A fragmented family beginning to find its way back to wholeness. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, as soft and gentle as forgiveness. Winter was starting to show signs of departure. On the bare branches of trees, small green buds appeared, silent promises of renewal. The sun, once shy and distant, lingered longer in the sky, gradually warming the cold earth. Nature, in its ancient wisdom, reminded everyone that even the harshest cycles eventually give way to fresh starts. In the small living room of Claire's apartment, morning sunlight spilled through thin curtains, creating golden patterns on the floor. Grace sat on the rug, carefully dressing her favorite doll in clothes specially chosen for the occasion. Edward was adjusting a discreet tie in the entryway mirror, while Claire finished fixing her hair in the bathroom. There was a solemn feeling in the air, a respectful hush that even 4-year-old Grace seemed to sense. Today wasn't a day for running through the park or shouting with laughter. It was a day for memories, for honoring the past and cementing the present. "Ready, sweetheart?" Claire asked, emerging from the hallway in a simple navy blue dress, her hair in a low bun. Grace nodded, standing up and clutching the doll to her chest. "Lily's ready too to meet Grandma," she declared with childlike innocence. Claire and Edward exchanged emotional glances over the girl's head. In recent weeks, since that conversation in the kitchen where so much had come to light, things had changed irreversibly between them. The constant tension of their first meetings had ebbed into a quiet truce, and then, gradually, a new kind of closeness. It wasn't the same relationship as before, nor could it ever be. It was something new, built on the foundations of the past, tempered by a deeper understanding of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. "Let's go," Edward said softly, extending his hand to Grace, who took it without hesitation. The cemetery was on the outskirts of the city, a peaceful place with old trees and stone benches along well-tended paths. Edward drove in silence, occasionally checking the rearview mirror for Grace, who gazed out the window with curious eyes. "Do you think Grandma will like my doll?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The question caught Claire off guard. How to explain death and remembrance to a 4-year-old? How to put into simple words the complexity of loss? "I'm sure she will, honey," Claire finally replied. "Your grandmother loved dolls. She kept all of mine, you know, in a special box in the attic." "Really?" Grace's eyes shone with interest. "Yes," Claire smiled at the memory. "She said she'd give them to my daughter one day, to you." Edward glanced at Claire, surprised to hear her speak about Eleanor so openly since learning of her passing. "Are they still there?" Claire asked carefully. "In the attic, I mean." "Yes," Edward confirmed, touched by the possibility of what she was implying. "Right where she left them." The rest of the drive went by in contemplative silence, which felt almost peaceful. When they finally parked near the cemetery's main gate, Edward drew a steadying breath. "Ready?" he asked Claire, who nodded without speaking. Edward knew the path to Eleanor's grave well. He'd walked it alone countless times over the past year, always bringing fresh flowers and unsaid words. Today, however, he wasn't alone. Today, he was fulfilling the promise he'd made to his wife in her last moments. The grave was simple, elegant in its understatement. A grey marble headstone with Eleanor's full name, her birth and death dates, and the inscription Edward had chosen so carefully: "Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. Her love lives on in us." Grace, who had been fairly quiet during the walk, now studied the headstone curiously. "Is this where Grandma lives now?" she asked in her small voice, echoing in the still air. "In a way, yes," Edward replied gently, kneeling beside her. "This stone marks where her body rests, but many people believe the spirit of those we love stays with us, even if we can't see them." "Like an invisible angel?" she asked. "Exactly like an invisible angel," Edward smiled, touched by her analogy. Claire stood a little apart, arms crossed over her chest, as if physically bracing herself against the emotions surging within. Her eyes locked on the headstone, as though looking beyond the stone for something of her mother. Edward rose and took a step back, sensing Claire needed this moment. Grace, following her grandfather's cue, also backed away, still clutching his hand. Slowly, Claire approached the headstone. She knelt on the still damp grass, not caring about her dress. For a long moment, she just stayed there, unmoving, hands on the cold marble as if searching for lingering warmth. "Hi, Mum," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry it took me so long." Edward felt a tightening in his chest. He saw the weight of loss Claire carried, not just a mother who had passed away, but the years they hadn't spoken, the questions unasked, the moments they'd never share. "Your last wish came true, Mom. I'm here," Claire continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're here." Grace, sensing the emotion in her mother's tone, slipped free of Edward's hand and walked toward Claire. With the direct simplicity of a child, she placed her beloved doll alongside the fresh flowers Edward had brought on previous visits. "Grandma can hold her for a bit," Grace offered, a gesture so pure that it broke through Claire's final defenses. She began to weep, tears of sadness and something else, grief for what was lost, but also gratitude for what was being rebuilt. Edward approached cautiously and knelt by her side. He didn't speak, just extended a hand in support. Claire looked at his offered hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she laced her fingers with his. The three of them remained like that for a while. Grandfather, mother, and child, gathered at the grave of a missing matriarch, each lost in their own thoughts, memories, and unspoken words. It was Grace who finally broke the silence, with that innocent wisdom only a child can have. "I think Grandma's happy now," she declared confidently. "Because we're all together." Claire smiled through her tears, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. "I think you're right, my love." Edward looked at them both, a wave of gratitude washing over him so powerfully it nearly overwhelmed him. For so long he'd lived in guilt and regret, believing he'd failed everyone he cared about. Now here he was, given a second chance he didn't deserve, but for which he was infinitely grateful. "Eleanor would be so proud of you too," he said softly. "Of you, Claire, for your strength, for raising such a wonderful daughter under such hard circumstances, and of you, Grace, for being exactly who you are. And of you too, Dad," Claire added, surprising him, "for finding the courage to change." The word Dad, spoken now with new acceptance, free of the bitterness it once carried, struck Edward like a sunbeam breaking through a storm. When they finally stood to leave, they did something that felt both natural and extraordinary. They held hands, Grace in the middle, holding her mother on one side and her grandfather on the other, forming an unbroken chain. They walked like that along the cemetery paths, united not just physically, but by something deeper, more resilient. They weren't a perfect family. There were still scars to heal, tough conversations ahead, adjustments to make. But they were a family, a real one, brought together by improbable circumstances, strengthened by a new kind of love that acknowledged mistakes, allowed forgiveness, and embraced imperfection. As they passed through the gates, the spring sun burst fully through the clouds, bathing them in a golden light. A new day, a new beginning, a new chance to do things differently. Together, spring had arrived in full bloom. The once barren trees now boasted vibrant green foliage. Colorful flowers bloomed in planters and gardens, filling the air with soft fragrances. The days grew longer, the sun more generous. It was a season of rebirth and new beginnings, the perfect backdrop for the change that was about to take place in Edward, Daisy, Claire, and Grace's life. Claire's small apartment was filled with boxes, some taped shut and labeled in her neat handwriting, others still open, waiting for the last items. Grace darted about, trying to help, though her help mostly involved unpacking items that had already been organized and asking endless questions. "Can I bring all my books, and my drawings, and Lily's house?" she asked, clutching the rag doll to her chest. "Yes, sweetheart, we're taking everything," Claire replied patiently, while folding Grace's brightly colored clothes. The decision hadn't been easy. After the visit to the cemetery, something had shifted definitively between Claire and Edward. Old wounds had begun truly healing. Conversations became easier, more honest. Claire allowed herself to talk about her mother, to ask questions about her final days, to share memories she'd kept locked up for so long. Late one night in the apartment kitchen, while Grace slept, Edward finally extended the invitation. "The house is too big for one person," he said, staring into his cup of tea. "It always was, even when there were three of us." Claire studied her father, noting the new lines on his face, the loneliness in his eyes since her mother's death. "Are you sure about this?" she asked cautiously. "It's a huge change for all of us." Edward lifted his gaze, determination in his expression. "I've never been so sure," he replied. "That house, it's where you grew up, where we should have been a family. Maybe we can try again. Do better this time." Claire mulled it over for several days, weighing the pros and cons, both practical and emotional. She spoke to Grace in simple terms, trying to gauge how her daughter felt about the move. "Live at Grandpa's house, with the big backyard and the tree to climb?" Grace had responded, eyes shining with excitement. "Can we go right now?" In the end, the decision was easier than Claire expected. The apartment, though filled with important memories, had always felt temporary. Edward's house, her childhood home, offered not just more space, but a chance to rewrite their story, to create new paths where before there had been only dead ends. Now, looking at the boxes containing her last 5 years of life, Claire felt a mix of nostalgia and relief. This place had been her refuge, her safe harbor when she needed to rebuild from nothing. But it had also been a symbol of her isolation, her daily struggle to stay afloat. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Grace ran to answer it. "Grandpa's here," she announced, though it was obvious. Edward entered, carrying coffee and pastries from a nearby bakery. "I figured we might need some extra energy," he explained, placing the bag on the table. Over coffee and a shared pastry, Grace got most of the chocolate frosting around her mouth. They went over the final details of the move. The truck would arrive in 2 hours. Mrs. Martha would come by later to say goodbye and return a set of keys. "Are you sure you don't want to keep the couch?" Edward asked, eyeing the worn but comfortable piece that took up much of the small living room. Claire shook her head. "We'll leave it for the next tenant. I've made arrangements with the landlord. Besides, you already have too much furniture." "True," Edward agreed. "Actually, I was thinking maybe you'd like to redecorate a bit, change some rooms, really make the house your own as well." Claire smiled, touched by the gesture. "Let's take it one step at a time." When the moving truck finally left, loaded with boxes and the few pieces of furniture they'd chosen to keep, Claire did one last walk through of the empty apartment. Her footsteps echoed in the bare rooms. So many memories in this small space. Grace's first smile, her first steps, nights of fever and nightmares, mornings spent drawing at the kitchen table. "Ready?" Edward asked gently, waiting at the door with Grace in his arms. Claire nodded, wiping away a stubborn tear. "Ready." The house where Claire had grown up was only 20 minutes away, in a quiet neighborhood lined with trees and well-tended gardens. It was a traditional 2-story home with a wide porch and a backyard that seemed designed for a 4-year-old's adventures. The moment they parked, Grace could hardly contain herself. As soon as Edward opened her car door, she bolted for the swing hanging from a large oak tree. "Careful, Grace," Claire called, worried. "Let her explore," Edward smiled. "The yard is safe. I closed off the back gate and checked the fence." Claire realized how much he had prepared for their arrival, taking care of every detail to welcome them. Emotion tightened her throat. Inside the house, more surprises awaited. Edward had made subtle changes, removing some of the more austere furniture and creating open, cozy spaces. Photos of Claire as a child that once were confined to albums now decorated the walls alongside recent pictures of Grace. "Come on," Edward called, leading them upstairs. "I want to show you something special." On the second floor, he opened the door to a room Claire recognized as the old guest room, but now it was completely transformed. The walls were painted a soft yellow. There was a new bed with a canopy and colorful sheets, shelves filled with books, a small table with art supplies, and most impressive of all, a detailed dollhouse in the corner, fully furnished and painted. "This is your new room, Grace," Edward announced, watching his granddaughter closely for her reaction. Grace stared, momentarily speechless. wide eyes scanning every detail. Then she let out a squeal of delight and ran inside, straight to the dollhouse. "It used to be your mum's," Edward explained to Claire, who stood beside him, clearly moved. "Eleanor saved it all these years. I restored some parts, repainted others. It's perfect," Claire managed, her voice choked with emotion. "You did all this by yourself?" Edward nodded. "I wanted Grace to feel at home right away, to know this place was always hers in a way, just waiting for her." Over Grace's excited exclamations as she explored every corner of her new room, father and daughter exchanged a look that spoke volumes, a look of gratitude, acceptance, and a cautious hope. Later, after they'd unloaded the boxes and arranged them provisionally, eaten pizza in the still messy living room, and waited for Grace to finally drift off in her new bed, but not before making Edward read 3 full stories, Claire found her father on the porch, gazing at the stars. "Thank you," she said simply, sitting beside him. "For all of this." Edward turned to her, his eyes shining in the soft light from inside the house. "I promise you, Claire," he said with conviction, "I'll never leave you again. I'll never let you or Grace down. This house is ours now. Yours, mine, and Grace's. A home for the 3 of us." Claire nodded, letting her head rest lightly on his shoulder the way she used to do when she was little. The gesture wasn't planned. It was instinctive, a return to a trust she had thought lost forever. Inside the house, within walls that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow, a new story was beginning. A story of second chances, of forgiveness, of renewed love. A home for 3, complete at last. Summer arrived with its generous light, bathing the house in a golden glow early each morning. 3 months had passed since the move, enough time for new habits to form, for unfamiliar spaces to become comfortable, for a new routine to settle in surprisingly well. The breakfast table became their daily gathering spot. Edward, always up first, prepared coffee and cut fresh fruit. Claire appeared next, still sleepy but smiling, carrying the newspaper from the front yard. Grace, always last to come down, hair a mess, arrived with Lily the doll tucked under her arm. "Good morning, family," she'd announce, as if each day were a wonderful discovery. On that particular July morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, creating bright patterns on the colorful tablecloth Claire had picked out weeks before. Edward was flipping pancakes on the stove, while Grace painstakingly placed strawberries on her plate in the shape of a smile. "Working late tonight?" Edward asked Claire, who was checking her schedule on her phone. "No, I'm off at 5, she replied. "I thought we could stop by the park on the way home. Grace has been talking about that new slide all week." "The rainbow slide," Grace confirmed enthusiastically, her mouth full of pancake. Edward smiled, dropping another pancake onto his granddaughter's plate. "Sounds like a perfect plan." Life had settled into a new rhythm. Claire kept her job at the diner, but now she only worked daytime shifts, leaving her more time with Grace. Edward had returned to part-time work at the architecture office, consulting on specific projects. It gave everyone space to adjust and find balance. Evenings were for family, board games in the living room, stories read aloud, dinners shared together. Occasionally, after Grace was asleep, Claire and Edward would sit on the porch with a glass of wine, talking about memories, plans, and reflections. Not everything was perfect, of course. There were tense moments, small disagreements, the usual need to adapt. Claire, used to making all decisions alone, sometimes struggled with sharing responsibilities. Edward, after living by himself for so long, occasionally needed solitude. But they were learning together, day by day, the delicate art of coexisting. Grace thrived in this new environment. Her room became her personal sanctuary, the walls decorated with her own artwork alongside family photos. The dollhouse constantly gained new furniture Edward crafted in his basement workshop from leftover wood. Outside, the old oak now held not just a swing but a small treehouse Edward and Grace had built over the weekends. "A Princess Grace Castle," read the sign, the letters unevenly painted by Grace herself. That late afternoon, as planned, they met at the park. Grace sprinted straight for the multicolored slide, joining other kids in line. Claire and Edward sat on a nearby bench, keeping their eyes on the little girl in a green dress climbing excitedly up the steps. "You look happy," Edward commented, observing his daughter's profile. Claire smiled, not taking her gaze off Grace. I am. In a way I never thought I could be again. I sometimes think of how much we almost lost, Edward reflected. If Grace hadn't walked into that coffee shop on that exact day, I believe we would have found each other somehow, Claire replied, surprising him. Maybe not in the same way or as soon, but I think some stories need to be completed. Edward nodded, moved by her words. Like ours. Like ours, she agreed. Grace slid down with a shriek of delight, waved to them, and ran to the back of the line for another turn. Mom talked a lot about second chances, Edward said after a pause, especially in her final days. She said life doesn't often offer them, and that when they come, we have to hold on with both hands. She was right, Claire replied. As always. The scars of the past hadn't vanished entirely. There were still memories that hurt, flashes of regret that surfaced late at night or in unguarded moments. Lost time could never be recovered, birthdays not celebrated together, school milestones not shared, holidays spent alone. But now those scars served as markers of a story of overcoming, not just pain. Reminders of not what they had lost, but what they had managed to rebuild. That evening, after Grace fell asleep, having insisted on yet another story, Claire found Edward in the study, sorting through old family photos into a new album. I found these in the attic, he said when she joined him. Thought Grace might like to see them one day, know her whole story. Claire sat beside him, picking up a photo of herself at about 6 years old, sitting on the same swing Grace now used. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For not giving up. For finding us, for bringing us home. Edward smiled, eyes glistening with restrained emotion. It was the only place you should have been. The next photo showed Eleanor, young and radiant, holding baby Claire in her arms. Her gaze seemed to hold all the love and hope in the world. She'd be proud of us, Claire said quietly, of how we found our way back to each other. Yes, she would, Edward agreed. And she'd be especially proud of you, of the strong woman you are, of the wonderful mother you've become. Claire squeezed her father's hand, a simple gesture that carried years of history. Pain transformed into acceptance, hurt turned into forgiveness. Upstairs, Grace slept peacefully, dreaming of rainbow slides, treehouse castles, and stories of fearless princesses. In her 4-year-old world, the family had always been complete. Grandpa, Mum, and daughter, bound by ties that, in her eyes, had always existed. In a way, she was right. Those ties had always existed, even when stretched by distance, time, and pride, unseen maybe, but never truly broken, just waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered, strengthened, celebrated. The old house, with walls that had witnessed so much, now held a new story, a story of rebirth, of forgiveness, of love found again. It was not just a happily ever after, but the beginning of something new and precious, a family, whole, at last. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like, because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.